What's the deal with Super NES Works Episode 18? We looked at the original Paperboy, or at least the Game Boy interpretation of it, a while back on Game Boy Works, and it was okay. And speaking of, okay, here's the sequel, Paperboy 2. This is what you call an extremely faithful sequel, to the point that it pretty much is just the same game with some minor tweaks. It feels very much like an 80s arcade game kind of sequel, a more varied twist on an existing game, balanced to be much, much more difficult. That's precisely why critics hated it at the time, because this didn't come to arcades in the 80s, but exclusively to consoles in the 90s. This is known as failing to read the room. The original Paperboy, of course, hails from Atari Games. It was one of the company's first creations after its schism from Atari Corp in 1984, and it helped keep the biggest name of gaming's golden era vibrant and alive well into the second half of the 80s. Part of the game's appeal was its novelty value. After all, instead of focusing on wild superheroics or fantasy shenanigans, Paperboy put players in the role of, well, a paperboy. It was one of the most mundane concepts imaginable for a video game, basically asking kids to use the money that they probably earned for riding a paper delivery route in order to pretend to ride a paper delivery route. That's a real power move, but it worked. The arcade cabinet had a distinctive interface decked out with real bike handles, and the gameplay presented its humdrum subject from an unconventional perspective. Paperboy used an isometric visual style which really stood out from 2D games of the era, and it played somewhat like a shoot-'em-up. Players pedaled forward through a residential neighborhood, dodging hazards while attempting to land newspaper projectiles in their customers' mailboxes or on their porches. It turned into a pretty big hit, and when Atari offshoot Tengen and publisher Mindscape brought it to NES a few years later, it made its way into something like 1 million homes. So, of course, a sequel wasn't far behind. The thing is, Atari Games didn't create Paperboy 2. There never was an arcade cabinet by that title. This sequel has only appeared on home systems, and it came from developer Tengen. While Atari and Tengen were related on some corporate level, to my knowledge there was no actual crossover between development talent for those two companies. Paperboy 2 doesn't include credits, and there doesn't appear to be any information online regarding the dev team behind the base version of the sequel, only some of its conversions. But it seems pretty safe to say that this was one of those cases of a licensee having huge success with someone else's property and then putting together their own sequels. This was a grand video game tradition in the 80s, remember? You know, all those crappy Pac-Man sequels that Namco never puts on collections? Or on the other side of things, all the slick Lode Runner console games Hudson and Irem produced without Broderbund's involvement. This was just another instance of that phenomenon in action. Tengen and Mindscape had a hit with Paperboy in 1988 and followed it up 3 years later with their own original sequel, Do Not Steal. Paperboy 2 is okay, but it definitely falls under the heading of completely unnecessary sequels. It adds a little bit to the Paperboy sandbox, and it has lots of amusing little extras, but it's pretty much the same thing as the first. One of the most noticeable additions appears right at the beginning. While this is called Paperboy 2, you can now choose to play as a paper girl. From what I can tell, this is a purely cosmetic option in which you simply control a slightly different sprite and see a female avatar in the newspaper summaries at the end of stages. But hey, inclusivity isn't hard, and it's nice to see a game from this long ago making the effort, especially when the title of the franchise kind of contradicts the entire idea of letting girls participate. Mechanically, Paperboy 2 works exactly the same as the original. You still pedal along in the lower corner of the screen, riding up along isometric landscapes, and chucking newspapers at homes and at other things. You're given a map of subscriber homes at the beginning of the stage. There are 20 homes in total, and you need to deliver papers to 10 of them. Hit all 10 of these targets perfectly and you'll gain an extra life and an additional subscriber. This is more easily said than done though, because the route is dark and full of terrors. Any subscriber's home you miss will cancel at the end of your route. There's no mercy for the paper delivery child in this hell world, I'm afraid. As in the original, in order to register a subscription, you have to land a paper either on the subscriber's porch or in their mailbox. Miss, and, well, too bad for you. Along the way, you can earn extra points for tossing papers at interactive elements on your route. If you see old people cuddling on a porch swing, you can earn extra points by knocking them backward. Or maybe you could score a bonus by knocking the prop rod from a car whose owner has his head under the hood for maintenance. Or maybe annoy a sunbather by activating a nearby sprinkler and soaking her. But it's not all rated E10 for comic mischief. No, the paperboy or papergirl can also occasionally perform noble deeds, like stopping a runaway baby carriage and preventing a baby-colored stain further down the sidewalk, or by stunning a burglar at the convenience store. You perform these feats, naturally enough, by throwing newspapers. While you're not penalized for annoying neighbors, so long as you deliver their subscription, performing good deeds gets you a mention in the papers at the end of the stage. As in the original game, you can pedal over stacks of newspaper to replenish your stock. Unlike in the original though, you can now throw papers both left and right. That's because, wow, Paperboy 2 features isometric graphics slanting in both directions. Midway through each stage, you cross a transitional street and make a 90-degree turn, at which point you toss papers in the opposite direction. This adds nothing to gameplay, but it's neat, I guess. Still, I'd rather Tengen have ironed out the quirks in the Paperboy concept in a meaningful way, rather than just tarting it up cosmetically. As in the first game, you still occupy a tiny little corner of the screen and have almost zero time to react to hazards that appear along the way. Cars and trucks and baby carriages appear suddenly and give you no real opportunity to dodge, so you really just have to avoid biking in any space where a hazard could appear. The isometric perspective continues to be vexing. It's extremely difficult to judge what is and is not safe ground for your bike, which has a rather large forward profile that doesn't pair well with a forced viewpoint. Another side effect of the viewpoint is that it's extremely difficult to maneuver laterally. You can't turn fully perpendicular to your required path along the street, and there are times when you'll see an unavoidable hazard looming inexorably, and you know you just can't dodge it no matter how hard you try. While the level layouts do provide you with little ramps and dirt mounds to jump over hazards, it can of course be tricky to hit these perfectly thanks again to the perspective. And there are many more hazards this time that you need to avoid. Paperboy 2 leans into the fantastic element of the original game, which previously just amounted to being chased by the Grim Reaper. Now seemingly half the houses on the block are somehow populated by mystical hazards. Gargoyles blast laser beams at passersby, medieval cannons launch fusillades, and there's an entire haunted house where ghosts, sewer monsters, and ravenous crows go after players. This has the side effect of making the game crazy hard, and it's incredibly unforgiving. While you have to deliver papers to 10 homes per day, you're penalized for wrecking your bike by being moved to a forward checkpoint beyond the current house. That is to say, if you lose a life on the approach to a subscriber home before hitting their mailbox with a paper, you're bumped ahead to the next house and miss your chance to deliver to the one you were on the approach to, resulting in an instant subscriber loss. And you have to weather 7 days in a row to even have a chance to reach the even more challenging second phase of the game, and 7 days of that to reach the incredibly hard final week. On the balance, I don't think Paperboy 2 is a bad game. It has some serious flaws, yes, things that should have been rectified from the original game, but it takes a silly and addictive premise and adds more variety and fun to it. Still, it does feel like a game out of time. This is by far the most simplistic game we've yet seen on Super NES Works, so I can see why critics of the era reamed it. Expectations for home console games had grown with the advent of 16-bit consoles, and Paperboy 2 comes to us lodged right in between the likes of ActRaiser and Final Fantasy II. Obviously those are different kinds of games, but compare this to other arcade-style titles like UN Squadron or Gradius 3, and it still comes off as incredibly thin on content. The one area in which it does feel like a product of its time is its soundtrack, which apparently was composed by Nick Eastridge of the same dev studio responsible for the Game Boy version of the original Paperboy. The music here doesn't have a lot of variety, but it has a lot of white funk. Eastridge, or whoever composed for this game, put those Super NES audio library slap bass samples to good use, even more so than the soundtrack to the Chessmaster. In fact, it uses the exact same Korg samples you hear in the Seinfeld soundtrack's bass riffs. And what could be more 90s than that? Of course, the premise dates the game every bit as much as the music. I mean, you're playing as a paperboy. The idea of kids being able to earn good money for a side job doesn't really exist in America anymore. And newspaper delivery is barely hanging on by a thread. See, back in the days before news was outsourced and automated, specifically to Russian bots, old people used a thing called newspapers, which contained dozens of pages of information about current events, sports, entertainment, opinions, all of which were printed daily. Because these existed on paper rather than as data, they had to be delivered physically to people's homes each day. This was a job usually delegated to kids and young teens, who would bike along and toss papers at people's doorsteps. By the time Paperboy 2 hit, though, deliveries were already mostly being handled by adults in cars. They could drive through the neighborhood and hit their targets a whole lot faster than kids on bikes could. Not only that, but morning edition papers are usually delivered around 5 a.m. or so. Paperboy 2's action takes place in broad daylight. That means you're delivering the evening edition paper here, something that had already largely vanished by 1991. In other words, everything about Paperboy 2 makes it a total relic. Too rooted in vanishing Americana to be relevant today, too rooted in arcades to work in consoles circa 1991, this is a strange game that existed in the wrong time and place. It's fun in its limited way, and there's definitely some anarchic satisfaction to be had in terrorizing the neighborhood while ostensibly providing a valuable service. But the clunky controls and shockingly cheap, untelegraphed hazards really dampen the joy of the experience. It's fine. The game's existence doesn't anger me, but neither does this seem in any way like something that needed to exist. Oh well. Anyone here remember newspapers? I used to have a paper route, yeah. Through a great neighborhood. Lots of really nice people there. My favorite was the guy who built a stone fortress, complete with a moat and cannon. It's like, buddy, the castle doctrine wasn't meant to be taken literally. He installed 4 cannons to the front of his home, fired a cannonball across the street every few seconds, all day long. Boom, 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 boom. It really makes you wonder what his neighbors could have done to piss him off that much. You know, as much as I hated biking past the place, at least the guy wasn't a subscriber. The pizza guy, I really feel bad for him. Remember that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles toy, the pizza thrower? Yeah, that was based on real technology. Created in our neighborhood, as a matter of fact. Hey Bill, fire up the pizza thrower. The castle guy wants a double combo with breadsticks again. Next on Super NES Works, are you ready for some football? Sorry, European and South American friends, not the good kind of football.